The wind never stopped in Pokrovskoye. It dragged across the snow like claws over linen, peeling back layers of silence that no one dared disturb. The village was a smear of soot and frost along the frozen Tura River, its wooden homes huddled like prisoners in winter's iron grip. In one of those homes, beneath a sagging roof patched with tar and old prayers, Rasputin was born. The midwife said nothing when she saw the boy's eyes, wide, black, and unblinking, as if he had already seen something he would never forget. His mother wrapped him in old cloth and rocked him without singing. His father, Efim, didn't look at him for 3 days. When he finally did, he spat once into the hearth and muttered, "Too quiet." Efim was a drinker, a fighter, a man carved from flint and shaped by cold. His hands were leathered from the reins, the whip, and the bottle. He beat the horses as he beat his sons, without hesitation, without pause, as if driven by something older than anger. Rasputin's older brothers didn't last. One drowned in spring melt, the other was taken by fever. Only Grigory remained, a thin child with dirt under his nails and silence in his bones. His mother, Anna, spoke rarely. When she did, her voice was like thawed river ice, slow, cracking, and dangerous. There was a church, but the bell hadn't rung since the priest died 5 winters before. No one replaced him. The villagers said the ground was cursed, that something under it refused rest. No one built a new altar. No one wanted to be the next to disappear. Grigory's earliest memories were of blood on snow, a man trampled by his own horse, a woman's hand crushed in a doorframe. The things no one cried over because they happened too often to matter. But one day, when Grigory was 10, something changed. He was alone behind the smokehouse, crouched in the dead grass, listening to the frozen river crack like knuckles. He heard it then, not a voice, not in the way people mean, but a sound, a pressure in his skull, like a nail driven into wet wood. Then the groan, low and breaking, like someone crying through clenched teeth. It was not the voice of God, it was the sound of God in pain. And it was coming from beneath him. He screamed. His father slapped him until he went quiet. "No devils," Efim muttered. "Only weakness." But the sound didn't stop. It came again, days later, while he was kneeling in the field after a snowfall watching frost swallow the grass. The groan, then words broken and stretched. "Do not let them." He vomited in the snow. He tried to tell the baker's daughter. She was 14 and kind to him in a way that confused him. He whispered that he heard things, that God spoke to him in the trees. She laughed nervously, touched his shoulder, then ran home. That night, she screamed in her sleep so violently her father locked her in the woodshed. The next morning, she wouldn't speak. Her mouth worked, but no sound came. The villagers said it was a demon. Rasputin didn't argue. He knew what he had felt when she touched his skin. Something pulled through him, like he was a doorway left open. After that, they called him cursed. Old women spit near his feet. Children threw ash at him during chores, but no one laid a hand on him. His father beat him less. His mother, once unreachable, began leaving bowls of milk near his cot without a word. When a cow went dry, they sent for him. He whispered to it and its milk returned. When a man's leg turned black from frostbite, Rasputin touched it and the rot slowed. They never thanked him. They never looked him in the eyes. His dreams changed. He saw a figure made of smoke and silver standing at the altar of the abandoned church. Its face was a skull, but its eyes bled light. It spoke to him, not with words but with weight. Each night, the figure would peel open its chest to reveal a heart pierced with nails. Rasputin would wake crying, holding his own chest, whispering apologies to no one. By the age of 12, he no longer felt fear, only hunger, Not for food, but for answers. He stopped sleeping under the roof. He wandered into the woods and spoke aloud to the trees. Once, he cut his palm and smeared blood on a birch trunk, asking it to listen. A week later, a man who mocked him was found hanging from that same tree, eyes eaten by birds. His father watched him from the corner of his eye now, never directly. When drunk, he would mutter about the devil wearing a child's skin. But he never raised a hand to him again, not after the fire. It was late. A lamp overturned in the shed. Flames reached high. The hay should have caught, the whole barn should have burned. But Grigory walked into the smoke and shouted. Not in Russian. Not in any language anyone knew. And the fire stopped. Froze mid-crawl. Smoldered into ash. After that, they left him alone. At 13, he walked the length of the river without shoes. He didn't eat. He didn't blink. He came back days later with frostbitten toes and a smile no one recognized. When asked where he went, he said, "To the mouth of the pain. It sings now." He began fasting, weeping without cause, laughing at sermons. He claimed the saints whispered to him in backwards chants, that the dead came to him in dreams not to frighten, but to warn. The villagers said he had the devil in him. But they never turned him out, because every time a child sickened, Rasputin sat beside their bed and whispered. And more often than not, the child woke. And when a woman miscarried in the snow, he sat with her as she bled, and the blood stopped. And when the ice broke early and a man fell through, Rasputin was the one who dragged him out, eyes closed, chanting a prayer no one had taught him. He never smiled for long. His joy flickered, strange and untrustworthy. He didn't play. He didn't beg. He only stared at things that weren't there and said things no one should say. And always, behind his eyes, the same question burned. Why had God chosen him to hear suffering? Why was he the vessel for pain that had no name? He didn't know, only that something ancient had started speaking through him. And it had no intention of stopping. They accused him of stealing a horse, though no one saw it. One moment, the animal was tied to a post, and the next, it was gone into the woods, its hoofprints lost beneath a sudden snowfall. The owner swore it had been Rasputin, said he saw his shadow near the stables, moving like smoke across the frost. Grigory didn't argue. He simply looked at the man, eyes black with sleep and silence, and turned away. That night, he vanished. He left without boots, just strips of cloth tied around his feet and a sack of crusted bread. The road was more instinct than path, pulling him north, then east, away from the flat riverlands and into the teeth of the Urals. He passed no one. When hunger overtook him, he ate snow. When it passed, he walked again. He followed no star, only the hum inside him, low and constant, like a voice beneath the earth still bleeding words. On the 5th night, the trees broke into stone, and there, hidden between cliffs and birch shadow, stood a crumbling monastery. No bell, no welcome. Just a rusted gate and smoke rising thin from a chimney slit. He knocked once, and they opened. The man who greeted him was tall and pale, with fingers like knots of rope. He asked no questions. He simply looked at Rasputin's eyes and said, "We are always watching." Then he let him in. Inside, it was not warmth that greeted him, but silence, thick, palpable, bruising. The monks didn't speak. They moved in shadows, heads bowed, hands red from cold or penance. They gave him water, a wooden bowl, and a place in the dormitory. No name was spoken, no reason given. Rasputin lay in the stone alcove that night, staring up at the beams overhead, wondering if he had arrived in a place of God, or something much older. In the days that followed, they tried to empty him. Of pride, of desire, of hunger. They made him fast, not just from food, but from speech, from warmth, from light. He scrubbed floors until his fingers bled. He stood in snow for hours, silent and barefoot, while the others watched from behind frosted panes. They left a scripture beside his cot, but never spoke its words. They watched to see if he would break. But Rasputin did not break. He began to smile, because he saw what they hid. Not all prayers were whispered. Some were moaned. Not all wounds were healed. Some were opened deliberately. Behind the chapel, in the candlelit crypts where outsiders were never meant to go, Rasputin found the real rituals. The hidden ones. Men kneeling in circles, naked beneath their robes, beating their backs with switches until the stones glistened. Blood was not spilled as sacrifice. It was celebrated. Their chants were not the words of Christ, but older echoes, fragments of Slavic heresy, twisted gospels, names erased from scripture. He was caught once, watching through a crack in the cellar wall. The monk who found him did not shout. He only smiled and said, "You hear it too, don't you?" That night, they let Rasputin enter, not as penitent, as initiate. They called themselves Kleasts, a word few dared utter in daylight. They believed salvation came through suffering. That pain cleansed what mercy could not. That ecstasy was not a sin, but a door, and the body must be broken to be opened. Rasputin listened. He watched. He did not flinch. In the third week, they placed a switch in his hand and told him to strike himself. He did. Once, twice. Then he smiled. He told them he had already bled more in silence than any man there. They believed him. They called him a vessel. They whispered that his suffering was a crown. He felt it, too. That strange warmth that came not from fire, but from collapse. When his body gave way to trembling, when his hands gripped the floor like a drowning man, clinging to the edge of the void, something entered. Not peace, not God, but vision. His mind would open like an eye turned inward, and he would see the faces of saints cracked like porcelain, smiling with broken teeth. He would hear children crying inside stone walls. He would feel blood dripping from the sky onto his tongue. And he would laugh, because none of it frightened him. It was familiar. One night, the oldest monk brought him to the chapel alone. He lit a single candle and placed it before the icon of Christ. The Savior's eyes, painted in ancient red and gold, stared down not with love, but with accusation. "If you are a vessel," the monk said, "pour." Then he handed Rasputin a knife. He took it without question. Rasputin pressed the blade to his palm and dragged it across, slow and deliberate. The blood welled, thick and black in the flickering light. He raised his hand and let it fall onto the icon, one drop, then another, staining the face of Christ. The monk did not recoil. He wept, then whispered, "Holy, holy, holy." Rasputin did not weep. He did not pray. He only looked at the blood, then at the face of God. And in that moment he felt nothing but power. He stayed for months. Time bent in that place. The sun came late and left early. His body grew leaner, his eyes darker. He stopped responding to his name. He took no vows, but all treated him as if he had. Some feared him. Others adored him. But all listened when he spoke. His voice had changed. It no longer wavered. It commanded. But something inside him warned, this place is not forever. One night he dreamed of fire. Not metaphor, not prophecy. Real fire. A monastery in ruins, monks screaming, a hand reaching for him through smoke, nails black with ash, and a voice, his own, saying, "Not here." He woke before dawn, packed nothing, spoke to no one. He walked out the same gate he entered, barefoot again, bleeding from the same palm, the wound reopened by choice. He did not look back. He would live as a holy man, but not a saint. He no longer believed in saints. When he returned to Pokrovskoye, no one recognized him at first. He was thin to the bone, beard tangled like roots, eyes sunken but burning with something feral. He carried no staff, no sack, no cross, just a strip of cloth bound around his bleeding hand, and the dust of places no one from that village had ever seen. His father had died in the year of his absence, fell drunk into the river and froze before morning. They found him with eyes open and lips blue. His mother was silent when Rasputin came to her door. She looked at him once and said only, "You're not mine anymore." Then she shut the door. He didn't knock again. He walked the village like a stranger walks the ruins of a dream. People watched him from behind curtains, whispering. But some came forward. A boy with a withered arm. A girl who hadn't spoken in weeks. He laid hands on them, muttered things under his breath that didn't sound like prayer. The boy's hand twitched. The girl laughed. They didn't call him holy, but they didn't turn him away. He began to speak in the fields, not from a pulpit but from stumps, stones, thresholds. His sermons were not sermons. They were riddles. He spoke of God not as a father, but as a wound that never healed. He said the flesh must be broken to reveal light. That shame was the mirror of the soul. That suffering was not punishment, but permission. He did not quote scripture, he quoted fire. They listened, and then the women came. It began with whispered confessions, then tears, then trembling hands grasping his robe. He would listen, touch their shoulders, press his forehead to theirs. And then they would vanish behind the smokehouse with him, and return looking raw and reborn. He told them God lived in the body, that their shame was a lie, that to be near him was to be near the divine, that pleasure was not the enemy of truth, it was the price of it. Some said he could see through them, that when he stared it was like drowning in ink and never wanting to surface. One girl said he kissed her and she forgot her name. Another said he never touched her, but she bled for 3 days after standing near him. Fathers grew nervous. Husbands stared hard at the ground. But no one stopped him, because when someone grew ill, they came to Rasputin, and Rasputin would touch the fevered brow, whisper something into the ear of the dying, and the breath would return. It didn't always work, but often enough that doubt was replaced with fear. He began to wander, first to nearby villages, then farther. He never asked for food, but was never without it. He slept in barns, in fields, in the corners of kitchens where widows watched him through veils of breathless awe. Children followed him. Drunks offered him their last coin. Prostitutes knelt in doorways and wept when he passed. He never preached to crowds. He spoke as if to God, and others simply listened. His words were half madness, half miracle. The sky does not forget what the earth buries. God eats what we hide in the dark. Sin is a garment, but I know how to undress the soul. He wandered like a storm carried by rumor. His name traveled faster than his feet. Grigory the Wanderer, the Mad Monk, the Holy Beast. They called him all these and worse. He smiled at every title. In time, his road curved toward Kazan, a city of domes and dust, where church and empire whispered in the same breath. There, amid the incense and rot of ancient cathedrals, he entered a chapel without invitation. He knelt before the altar as if it owed him something. He did not cross himself, he did not bow, he only knelt, eyes closed, lips moving with no sound. A bishop saw him. Bishop Theophan, a man of high standing, education, and deep suspicion. He had heard of Rasputin, did not believe the tales. But when he stepped closer, something in him faltered. The man kneeling before the altar was not praying. He was listening. And what chilled Theophan was not what Rasputin said, but the stillness with which he said it, as if he were being dictated to by something only he could hear. They spoke that night. Rasputin did not flatter, did not kneel, did not ask for blessing. He spoke as if he had already been anointed by something the bishop did not understand. He said things that no peasant should know, passages from ancient apocrypha, phrases in Greek and Slavonic that had not been uttered in a century. He described the bishop's childhood nightmares without ever being told. He recited the bishop's secret vow, the one he had made alone in the garden at age 15 when he begged God not to take his sister. Theophan did not report him. He invited him to stay. And in those weeks he studied Rasputin the way a man studies a knife with blood on its edge, not to condemn, but to understand whether it should be used again. He said later in his journals, never published, "This man is not a prophet, he is not a demon, he is a doorway, and something ancient is pressing to get through." Rasputin left Kazan as suddenly as he arrived, but now he was no longer just a whisper. He was a pilgrim, and behind him the path he left was wet with tears, blood, and awe. The train from Kazan arrived at St. Petersburg under a sky of broken glass. Winter hung over the city like a funeral veil. The snow did not fall softly here. It fell with intent, covering the stone streets in silence and judgment. Rasputin stepped off the platform wearing a threadbare coat, his boots caked in old blood and dried manure. He smelled of goat, of wood smoke, of something sweet rotting under the surface. People moved aside without knowing why. He didn't ask for direction. He moved as if pulled by wires no one else could see, crossing avenues without looking, staring up at buildings as if they breathed. The city was a maze of marble and rust, gold crosses tarnished by the cold breath of revolution. But he was not lost, because the voice inside him, older now, heavier, had said, "There is a woman in black silk. She has already dreamt of you." They didn't let him in at first. The guards at the palace laughed. One said he looked like a beggar. Rasputin stared at him, silent for a full minute. The laughter stopped. Within a week, the guard's youngest daughter was dead from a fever that had no name. Rasputin didn't return to the gate. The invitation came instead. Lady-in-waiting to Her Majesty, Alexandra Feodorovna, wife of Tsar Nicholas II, sent for him. Word had traveled like smoke. A holy man, a peasant mystic who healed with hands and silence. The Tsarina was not well. Her heart was a cracked shell, and inside it bled only worry. Her son, Alexei, the Tsarevich, had been born with a curse, hemophilia. One fall, one bruise, and he could bleed to death. The court physicians offered opium and prayer. Nothing worked. Nothing stayed the bleeding. Until Rasputin entered the nursery. He did not bow. He did not speak for the first minute. The child lay pale, wrapped in bandages, eyes dull with pain. Alexandra stood beside him like a ghost, tied to a candle. Rasputin approached the boy and placed his hand on the child's chest. He closed his eyes. The room fell still. Even the wind outside stopped scratching at the windows. He whispered something. No one could hear it clearly, just syllables like the sound of a nail being pulled from wood. He touched the boy's head, then his side, then whispered again. And the boy slept. By morning, the swelling had gone down. The fever had broken. The bleeding had stopped. The court physician, Dr. Botkin, said it was coincidence. A fluke. Alexandra did not agree. That night she wrote in her diary, "A man of God has come to us. I fear him more than death, but when he touches Alexei, the angels hold their breath." Rasputin did not linger. He did not ask for reward, but he returned the next day and the day after. Soon, he no longer waited for summons. He came and went as he pleased, robes stained with ash, beard unkempt, but eyes burning with certainty. The servants hated him. The guards watched him with unease. But Alexandra, she obeyed. She said he was a gift, that his prayers saved her son, that he spoke the words she could never say aloud. He called her simply Mother. In the evenings, he sat with her alone, reading from books no one had brought into the room. He spoke of visions, of fire in the east, of wolves circling the throne, of blood spilled in a cellar far from now. She listened, hands trembling. He told her the boy must never be left alone, that the empire would fall if Alexei's blood ever spilled again. She believed him. He was given a room in the palace, not in the wing of nobles, but in the servants' hall. He never asked for luxury, only a place to pray and silence. But still, his influence grew. The ministers who crossed him found their petitions blocked. Generals who doubted him lost their commands. Whispers began to bloom like mold in the draperies. The monk is seducing the empress. The monk is poisoning the air. The monk is not a monk at all. And still, he walked through the corridors like he owned the darkness between the chandeliers. One night, a maid caught him speaking to a mirror. His reflection did not move with him. She fainted and was gone the next day. Another servant said she heard him in the chapel, not praying, but laughing. That his laughter echoed even after the doors were closed. The Tsar tolerated him, not out of faith, but out of fear. Alexandra begged her husband to listen. "He is the only one who hears God clearly," she whispered. Nicholas, weary and worn from the war beyond the walls, simply nodded. And Rasputin continued. He told her when to speak and when to fall silent, which letters to write, which ministers to trust, and every time Alexei fell ill again, it was Rasputin who sat at his side and Rasputin who brought him back from the edge. One evening, the boy began coughing blood. The doctors prepared for death. Rasputin arrived hours later, barefoot, eyes bloodshot from walking for 3 nights without sleep. He kissed the boy's forehead and whispered, "Not yet." By morning, the blood had stopped, and the Tsarina believed now not just that he was a man of God, but that without him God would not listen. They dressed him in fine linen, but he wore it poorly. He preferred his rags. He said the silk made him sweat. But once he wore a black robe, woven for him by hand. He wore it the night he stood in the imperial chapel and told the Tsarina, "I have seen the empire fall, but if I live, it will not." She wept at his feet. He did not bless her. He placed a hand on her head and said, "Even you must bleed to understand the boy." That winter, snow buried the city deeper than it had in 20 years. The sun did not rise before 8, and even then it brought no warmth. The people outside starved. Soldiers froze in trenches. Revolutionaries whispered louder. But in the palace, Rasputin prayed beside the boy, and the boy lived. And outside the palace, the wolves began to gather. Years passed like water beneath ice, slow, muffled, dangerous. The war dragged on, and St. Petersburg, now called Petrograd, wore its grief openly. Bread lines curled around shattered statues. Soldiers returned without limbs, without purpose. Revolution crackled in alleyways, murmured in cafes, etched itself into walls in red chalk. But inside the palace, Rasputin did not flinch. He walked its halls with the quiet arrogance of a man who had already survived the fire. Nobles bowed when he passed, not from respect but from dread. Those who mocked him once now spoke his name with care. Those who resisted him were removed, quietly, not by force, but by vanishing. A general stripped of title after a single rumor. A bishop recalled to some distant diocese after a letter, unsigned, reached the Tsar's desk. Even Prime Minister Stolypin, who dared question Rasputin's influence, met a bullet in the opera house. No proof, no witnesses, but all knew who had condemned him, and Rasputin never denied it. When asked, he would shrug, eyes half-lidded, voice lazy. God removes what offends him. I simply whisper. Whispers became edicts. His words, muttered over a glass of wine, tossed carelessly in drawing rooms thick with perfume, carried the weight of imperial decree. Alexandra defended him with zeal. She called him friend, healer, our guardian. Ministers begged her to reconsider. The Duma railed, but she would not bend, because every time Alexei's joints swelled with blood, every time the boy hovered at death's door, it was Rasputin who pulled him back. The Tsar drifted in a haze of indecision. He trusted Alexandra. Alexandra trusted Rasputin. That was enough. And so, slowly, the machinery of empire tilted toward a man who wore no crown, signed no orders, but spoke with the thunder of finality. Outside the palace, the stories festered. They said Rasputin held orgies in candlelit basements, where naked noblewomen wept in ecstasy at his feet. That he mixed blood with sacramental wine. That he spoke incantations in Old Church Slavonic, words forbidden since the burning of heretics. That he baptized prostitutes in icy rivers and kissed them with tongues of fire. That he could see through walls, walk through locked doors. That he had once raised a dead child in the mountains, only to strike it down again when it tried to speak. He laughed at the rumors, mocked them openly. He called them his little monsters, said they amused him more than poetry. But late at night, behind the thick velvet of his chamber, he did not laugh. He wept. He wept like a man whose skin no longer fits his soul. He locked the door, dimmed the lamps, and knelt before his icons. Saint Nicholas, Saint Seraphim, the Virgin of Kazan, and pressed his forehead to the cold floor. He whispered prayers that stank of desperation. His voice cracked, his hands trembled. Sometimes he struck himself across the face until his lips bled. Other times he clutched the icon of Christ so hard it splintered in his grip. Once, the maid found fragments of holy wood in his bedsheets, soaked with blood. He never explained, because no one ever asked, no one dared. He began drinking more, not wine, spirits, raw, colorless, flammable. He would drink in silence for hours, then erupt into laughter that felt like it belonged to someone else. His skin grew gray, his breath fouled, his eyes darkened, but his power only grew. Petitions were brought to him instead of to the throne. Widows knelt before him with trembling hands. Priests asked his blessing. Generals waited for his nod before issuing commands. Alexandra asked no one before asking him. She wrote to him daily, even when he slept in the next wing. Letters filled with anguish, praise, longing, and awe. "You are our only light," she once wrote. "Without you, I do not believe we would breathe." He told her who to trust and who to discard, and she obeyed. In silence, he erased names. Men who opposed him found themselves posted to distant fronts. Women who slighted him lost their invitations to court. Priests who questioned his authority were reassigned, reprimanded, or disgraced. A single word from Rasputin, unworthy, was enough to unmake a man's career. He never kept lists. He didn't need to. He remembered every face, every kindness, every insult, and the voice inside him, that old, wet whisper, told him what each person deserved. He believed it, until the nights grew too quiet, until he began waking in terror, not from dreams, but from the absence of them. He would sit bolt upright in his bed, drenched in sweat, heart galloping. The silence around him was suffocating. The voice no longer spoke. The visions no longer came. And in that void, he began to suspect what he had become. A man chosen by God, or a man used by something else? One night, he walked barefoot into the palace chapel. His eyes were bloodshot. He had not slept in 2 days. He stood before the crucifix and whispered, "If you are still there, speak, or I will." The crucifix did not answer. He laughed and walked out into the snow. Behind him, the candles in the chapel guttered and died, and in the city beyond the gates 100 voices plotted his end. The child's name was Natalia. She was 8, small, pale, a minister's daughter with a voice like wind through lace. Her family had come to the palace on a winter's evening, part of a private gathering hosted by Alexandra herself. The ministers brought their wives, their daughters. There was music, cognac, conversation in hushed tones. The empire was burning, but inside those velvet walls, the illusion of grace still held. For one more night. Natalia vanished after the second course. They searched the halls, the chambers, the servants' quarters. She was found just before dawn, in the courtyard, face turned upward to the sky, eyes open, lips blue. No wound, no blood. Just snow in her hair and a single bruise at the base of her throat. A servant said she saw Rasputin walking the halls that night, barefoot, his hands trembling, whispering to himself. Another said they saw him near the courtyard, standing beneath the frost-covered statue of St. Michael, speaking to the darkness like it had spoken back. The rumors ignited like dry grass. The minister demanded answers. Alexandra offered condolences. Rasputin said nothing. He did not flee. He did not explain. He did not even flinch. He only stared at the father with a strange, sorrowful calm and said, "She was already gone before I arrived." The child was buried with military honors. The church gave a blessing. The whispers, however, did not stop. A bishop, one of the few who still dared speak openly, called for Rasputin's exile. He named him in his homily, called him a corrupter, a deceiver, a poison in sacred robes. Said the devil wears the face of the healer when he wishes to destroy. Said the rot at the root of the empire had a name, and it was Rasputin. 3 days later, the bishop was found hanging in his study. No note, no signs of struggle. A crucifix in one hand and in the other a slip of paper with a single word, "Forgiven." There was no investigation. The Tsarina personally ordered his funeral arrangements. She said the bishop had been under great strain, that grief warps the soul, that not even the faithful are immune to despair. No one believed her, but no one challenged her. Rasputin said nothing, only fasted for 3 days. When asked why, he said he had seen something in a dream, that the bishop was not dead, only removed. By now, the palace was half prison, half shrine. Ministers came only when summoned. Letters were burned after reading. Alexandra kept Rasputin's notes folded into her corset. He wrote to her daily, sometimes hourly. Sometimes nothing but the same phrase repeated again and again. Hold. The blood must not spill. But it did. And not just in the streets. A laundress miscarried after seeing Rasputin pray in the hall. said his eyes were white and she felt her child die the moment he passed. A kitchen boy screamed in his sleep for a week, saying the monk was standing over his bed with a crown made of teeth. A stable hand broke his own fingers to avoid serving him. The whispers grew teeth. The monk is a devil. He drinks from the wounds of the dying. He walks through locked doors. He will not die. Rasputin, for all his calm, was changing. His skin looked waxen, drawn tight over cheekbones like parchment stretched over bone. His eyes no longer blinked when he spoke. He began hearing things again, scratches behind the walls, bells that no one else could hear, voices calling his name from inside mirrors. He told no one. He wrote it down, burned the paper, then fasted again. The visions returned, not of angels, not of saints, but of fire. He saw the palace burning, walls weeping ash, the boy lying still beneath a shattered chandelier. He saw Alexandra screaming as the walls closed in. He saw the Tsar dragged through snow by his wrists. He saw soldiers weeping as they shot children. He saw ropes. So many ropes, tightening around white throats. Russia was choking on its own history, and in the dream, it wore a crown of ice. He began to mutter to himself during meals. He refused to eat meat. Said the blood of animals was starting to taste too much like ours. He dug a trench in the garden with his bare hands. Said it was for the thing that would come in the spring, then filled it with salt and ash and buried one of his own teeth in the center. One night, Alexandra found him kneeling in the chapel, clawing at his chest with broken fingernails, whispering, "They want the boy. They want the blood. They want the Empire's last breath." She tried to soothe him. He struck her, just once, across the cheek, then fell to his knees and kissed her hand until it shook. She said nothing, wore a veil the next day, told the staff it was for Lent. Rasputin stayed in his chamber for 2 weeks. When he emerged, he was barefoot again, and smiling. The night he wrote the letter, the snow outside the palace was falling sideways, wind slicing through it like it meant to peel the flesh from the city itself. Rasputin sat alone at the writing desk in his chamber, hunched like an animal that had learned to pray by watching the dead. A single candle lit the room. The flame bent to the draft, its shadow dancing across the icon of the Virgin that hung crooked above the doorway. He had not slept in 3 nights. His hand trembled as he wrote, not from cold, but from something else, something behind him, watching, waiting. He didn't turn to look at it. He knew it had no face. He wrote quickly, the letters wide and looping, ink spilling in places like veins split too quickly. To His Imperial Majesty, Nicholas II, Tsar of all the Russias, he began, but it was not a salutation, it was a warning. If I am to be killed by common men, the throne will stand. The empire will suffer, but it will not fall. But if I am murdered by nobles, those who bathe in silk and speak with honeyed tongues, then the blood of the Romanovs shall run like water. And within 2 years, not one of your children shall remain alive to inherit your sorrow. He paused. The wind howled. Somewhere below, a window cracked. He dipped his thumb into the cup beside him, wine mixed with a drop of his own blood. He pressed it to the bottom of the letter, a red thumbprint, like a seal, like an accusation. He folded the letter with trembling fingers, wrapped it in wax-stamped cloth, and placed it in an envelope. It bore no name, just a symbol, a cross with 2 slashes through its spine. He delivered it himself to the Tsar the next morning. Nicholas took it without speaking. He did not read it immediately. He tucked it into his journal near the back, between a page about troop movements and a faded pressed flower from his wedding. He would never speak of it again, but Rasputin knew it had been read. He could feel the weight of it settle over the palace like a slow, rising tide. That night, he slept for the first time in days. But he did not rest. He woke at dawn, screaming. There were marks on his back, 3 deep slashes from shoulder blade to spine. No blade could have made them. Too shallow for a knife, too precise for a fall. They did not bleed, but wept a clear fluid that smelled faintly of incense and iron. He said nothing to the doctor, simply turned his back and asked for salt. He poured it himself into the wounds and whispered, "It's the angel. She's near now." When asked what angel, he only smiled. They came again, the marks, every few nights, always in 3s, always down the back, never the front, as if he had turned his back on something too holy to face. He began sleeping on the floor. Cold stone soothed the burning. He stopped drinking, then started again, then fasted, then wept for hours. The Tsarina noticed his weight loss, his shaking hands. She asked if he was ill. He answered, "Not yet, but I am being unmade." She begged him to leave the city, to retreat just for a while, to the countryside, a monastery. Somewhere the voices couldn't find him. He said it was too late for retreat. The crown has already been nailed in place. The blood is already waiting for the snow. He spoke now in riddles again, of wolves with gold teeth, of a girl in white who stood at the foot of his bed and counted backward from 17, of a river that would turn red without a single body floating in it. He walked the halls at night, barefoot, eyes wide, muttering prayers in dead dialects. Once, a soldier said he saw Rasputin walk through a locked door. Another said he saw him standing in the chapel, unmoving, as a candle behind him bent toward him, flame first. Another claimed to have woken with Rasputin at the foot of his bed, whispering the names of the soldier's dead siblings, one by one. And still, Alexandra defended him. She said his mind was burdened with the weight of prophecy, that God did not choose the beautiful to carry his truth, but the broken. She brought him thicker robes, brushed his hair like a mother brushes a fevered child, and when he screamed in his sleep, she held his hands until the shaking stopped. But the court had turned against him fully now. The nobles whispered openly, said he had ensorcelled the empress, that he was a witch, a beast, a foreign agent sent to corrupt the empire from within. They spoke of poison, of knives, of rivers. He knew their names, he knew their intentions. He wrote them down on scraps of parchment and burned them in front of the icon of St. George. Said the smoke would tell him which hand would strike the first blow. But still, he did not flee. He told Alexandra, "I have already seen how I die, and it is not by chance, it is a sacrifice." She wept, but made no effort to stop it. Outside, the snow grew thicker, the air colder. The windows of the palace now rattled not just from wind, but from the weight of something approaching, something with boots, and rope, and silence. The letter arrived folded in cream parchment, sealed in wax the color of dried rose petals. No insignia, no flourish, just a single line in hurried script. "You are cordially invited to tea at the home of Prince Felix Yusupov. A matter of utmost spiritual importance." Rasputin read it once, then again, then smiled. He did not hesitate. December had pressed its weight onto Petrograd like a hand over a mouth. The streets were quieter now. Carriages moved slowly, their wheels biting into the frozen mud. Windows were shuttered, not just against the cold, but against the silence that had begun to feel watched. Rasputin walked the distance himself, refused the sled, said the cold kept his thoughts pure. He wore no gloves. Yusupov's mansion loomed like a confession, baroque, empty, echoing with wealth that had forgotten how to speak. The guards at the gate did not meet his eye. Inside, a fire crackled. Wine was uncorked. Music played softly, as if trying to apologize for what was about to happen. They led him to the basement. The air was close, too warm. The chandelier above the table swayed, though there was no draft. Rasputin sat. Prince Yusupov smiled with too many teeth. They spoke of the war, of Alexandra's faith, of how the soul must be pierced before it can be seen. Wine was poured. He drank. Cakes were offered. Almond, soft, sweet, laced with enough cyanide to kill 5 men. He ate and smiled. An hour passed, then 2. Yusupov's hands began to tremble. Rasputin, still grinning, asked for more wine. Said the room smelled of lilies and secrets. Said he had dreamt of this place, that he knew the basement's true name, that the stones remembered screams. Panic bloomed behind the prince's eyes. At last, a revolver was drawn. 1 shot. Rasputin staggered. Blood bloomed through his chest like a rose in fast motion. He collapsed. Silence. Yusupov exhaled. The other conspirators crept in, noblemen, officers, men who believed they were saving an empire. They surrounded the body, watched it for signs. None came. They unbuttoned his coat. The blood was warm. Then his eyes opened, not wide, not wild, just open, as if he had only blinked. Yusupov screamed. Rasputin stood, staggered once, then lunged. A guard raised his pistol too late. Rasputin crashed through the door, into the hallway, then up the stairs, blood dripping behind him, footsteps echoing like gunshots. The house convulsed. Men shouted. Footsteps collided. He burst through the kitchen, into the courtyard, into the snow. They chased him. A second shot rang out, then a third. He stumbled, fell to one knee, crawled, clawed, a 4th shot, then silence. They dragged him back inside, laid him out on the floor like an offering. His chest heaved, his lips moved. The priest among them swore he heard Rasputin say, "They won't believe you." Another shot, this time to the head. They wrapped the body in a rug, bound it with chains, carried it through the sleeping city, down alleyways slick with frost, across the frozen Neva River to a hole carved into the ice. They rolled the rug in, watched it sink, said nothing. 3 days later, the river gave up its secret. The body was recovered. The autopsy, done in haste and fear, revealed what none could explain. Poison had been present, but not fatal. The gunshots had done damage, but none were immediately lethal. The cause of death? Drowning. His lungs were filled with river water. He had still been breathing, still fighting. Even after the bullets, even after the betrayal. The palace wept in silence. Alexandra locked herself in her chamber for 3 days. She burned every letter he had written to her, save one. The one where he said he had seen her son's blood in the snow and no one around to stop it. She folded it into a locket and wore it beneath her dress until the day the soldiers came for her. Outside, the nobles toasted. The people rejoiced. The devil was dead, they said, but the sky that day was darker than it should have been, and the river never froze quite the same again. The palace fell quiet. Not the quiet of peace, but the hollow, aching quiet that follows the snapping of a bone. Too sudden, too final to process. Rasputin's chamber was sealed. No one touched the sheets. No one lit the lamp, yet the air inside never cooled. Servants claimed they heard footsteps at night, the sound of water dripping. The scent of wax and iron clung to the curtains even after they were washed. Alexandra wore black from that day forward. She forbade music. She covered the mirrors. She burned his portrait, then wept in the ash. At meals, she set a place for him in silence. No one dared move the plate. The nurses said she whispered to the empty chair, that she asked it what to do, that sometimes it answered. Alexei grew pale. He no longer slept. When he did, he woke screaming. He said the man in the dark robes had gone into the river but left part of himself behind, that he saw him now in puddles, in polished glass, in dreams, that his voice had changed. Lower, slower, like someone speaking from under ice. The Tsar tried to hold the family together. He spent his mornings in Rasputin's old room, kneeling before the same icons the monk had once bled on. He lit candles, crossed himself, wrote letters to no one. Prayers, he called them, but they read more like apologies. I should have listened sooner. I should have kept him close. He was not a devil. He was the last warning. Outside the palace, winter bloomed into collapse. Soldiers deserted their posts, factories closed, bread vanished. The people, hungry, bitter, cold, began to chant names the Tsar had never heard. Lenin, Trotsky. Revolution moved like smoke through the streets, invisible until it caught fire. Riots ignited where silence had once sufficed. No more whispers, no more fear. The monarchy cracked. First in pieces, then in avalanche. The Tsar abdicated. The empire he had inherited dissolved in days. What had taken centuries to build now fell apart like rotted paper. The royal family was moved under guard to Alexander Palace, then later to Tobolsk, then finally to Yekaterinburg. Alexandra clutched her rosary until the beads left welts in her palms. She said Rasputin had warned them, that if nobles killed him, the family would die. He saw it all, she whispered. He told me. He begged us to believe. Nicholas said nothing. He watched the snow fall and wrote in his journal with hands that had forgotten how to hold power. The children stopped asking questions. They understood. And still, no one said his name aloud. Not Rasputin, not Grigori. He had become a shape in the shadows, a presence stitched into every curtain fold and floorboard. When lights flickered, they said it was the monk. When a guard slipped on the stairs and broke his neck, someone muttered it was the monk. When the Tsarina woke with bruises on her arms, she could not explain. She clutched her chest and whispered, "Not now. Please. It's too late." And it was. On a warm July night in 1918, the royal family was told to dress. They were led to a basement by soldiers with tight mouths and dull eyes. Alexandra held her son's hand. Nicholas looked behind them once, as if expecting someone else to follow. The daughters wore white. They were told they would be photographed. Then, without warning, the gunfire began. It was not clean. The bullets tore through fabric, glass, bone. The girls did not die immediately. Their corsets, lined with jewels sewn in panic, deflected the first volleys. The soldiers had to use bayonets. The boy was last. He cried out once, reaching for someone who wasn't there. Then nothing. The bodies were stripped, burned, buried in haste. The silence that followed was deeper than the one that came before. And somewhere, under the soil of Siberia, a man who had drowned in ice began to rot a second time. But not all the way, because the river still remembers. And in the dreams of dying empires, his voice still echoes. If I fall, the house falls with me. They wrote him out of the official histories within a year, called him a charlatan, a drunk, a peasant who tricked a desperate woman and hypnotized a dying boy. The Soviet state dismissed him as folklore, an embarrassment of the old world, buried with the czars and their shame. Scholars said he exploited ignorance. Clergy said he perverted grace. Physicians called him a manipulator of the weak, and the world, eager to move on, believed them. But the record is never clean. In the archives of the Cheka, sealed for decades, brittle with mold and secrecy, there is a file. Its pages are faded, blacked out in places, stained with something that looks like blood but isn't. The file does not appear in the official catalog. It is labeled Subject 71 Gyar. Handwritten notes describe 2 events. The first, a soldier on leave in Petrograd, winter of 1922, stumbles into an alley to piss behind a bakery, sees a man crouched beside a fire made from torn hymnals, long beard, barefoot, hands wrapped in red cloth. The man looks up, smiles, says nothing. The soldier backs away, reports it days later in a drunken haze. He's discharged for mental unfitness within the month, writes in a letter to his brother. He had no shadow. The second, a church outside Vologda, 1928. Abandoned, collapsed roof, sealed by the state. A survey team records signs of occupation. Footprints leading in and out, but no break-in. A candle burned to its base. Scorch marks in the shape of 2 open palms on the floor before the altar, and on the wall, scratched into stone, the wound is where the light enters. They chalk it up to vagrants, but one officer writes a margin note. Matches known subject profile. Continue observation. Do not publish. There are no photographs, but the rumors never die. Old men in rural villages still swear he was seen wandering the roads during the famines, blessing empty wells, kissing sick children on the forehead, then vanishing before the death count could rise. A nun in Leningrad claimed she heard him whisper in her ear during Mass in 1941, though the doors had been barred for decades. A priest in exile swore he met a man in Istanbul who bore the same wounds, long healed, on his back, who wept when he saw an icon, who said only, "I was supposed to die, but the water wouldn't let me." His body, recovered from the river, had been buried in secret. Then dug up, then burned. But the ashes, those were never found. The guards tasked with the cremation could not agree on what happened. One claimed the body screamed as it burned. Another said it sat up. A third said nothing at all, only drank until the day he died. The urn was supposed to go to a government archive, but it never arrived. The paperwork vanished. The man who signed the receipt was never located. To this day, there is no physical trace, just the echo, just the fear, and the dreams. Because certain men, never more than 1 or 2 at a time, still dream of him. A man in rags, standing beside a fire. Eyes that flicker like candlelight in water. Hands covered in blood that never dries. He says nothing. Or he says one sentence over and over in a voice like velvet being torn. The wound is where the light enters, and I am full of light. Those who dream of him wake changed. Some write compulsively, others disappear. One renounces politics, another walks into a frozen lake and is never found. These dreams are not shared, except in whispers, but they are tracked. The security services still file reports, though they no longer know why. Because Rasputin is dead, that's what the history books say. He drowned, he was poisoned, he was shot in the head, beaten, drowned again, and burned. And yet, the Tsar's line is gone, the crown is dust, the empire a memory. But the monk, the peasant, the blasphemer, the prophet, they still speak his name. Not openly, not aloud, but deep in the catacombs of Russian memory where truth and myth braid like rope, he waits. Not for resurrection, but for recognition. Not for power, but for proof that what he said was true. that he was never a man. Not really. He was a mirror, and those who looked too long saw not him, but themselves, undone by the light leaking through the cracks in their own soul. And when the silence finally returns to Russia, not red with war or white with snow, but black with memory, the voice that rises to greet it will be his, not because he survived, but because he was never meant to die.